I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 84 of EO Radio Show. In today's episode, I talk with guest and friend Bill Boyd, one of the editors, along with Lisa Runquist, of the newly published fourth edition of the American Bar Association's Guidebook for Directors of Nonprofit Corporations. This guidebook is a useful and valuable reference that provides directors with an overall understanding of their role and duties. This updated edition addresses general legal principles and areas of broad concern to assist the directors and the organization to obtain the information they need to run an effective organization. Included in the guidebook are user-friendly charts, checklists, and much more. Join me in this interesting conversation with Bill Boyd. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. Today's episode focuses on the newly published fourth edition of the ABA Guidebook for Directors of Nonprofit Corporations. The guidebook is a valuable reference for directors of nonprofit corporations in the United States, from the smallest corporation operating at a local or even neighborhood level to the largest nonprofit corporations across the United States and also those operating internationally. The book provides general legal principles as they apply to nonprofit corporations and offers useful and practical suggestions and checklists. Written by leading lawyers in the nonprofit industry, the guide assists directors of nonprofits on how they perform their duties and provides an overall understanding of their role in respect of the corporations they serve. This fourth edition reflects issues that affect directors of nonprofit corporations today. While the issues are unchanged from what they were in previous editions, they reflect today's realities and recent legal developments. The guidebook also identifies developing trends and legal issues that are likely to affect nonprofit corporations and their directors in the future. Here to tell us all about the guidebook is Bill Boyd. Bill is a shareholder of the law firm Nymaster Good, based in Des Moines, Iowa. Bill works primarily with corporate entities on acquisitions, secured loans, and contracting matters, as well as on governance, organizational, operational, and planning issues. He advises healthcare and health insurance clients on regulatory matters and government contracts and compliance measures. In addition, Bill represents financial institutions on transactional matters and bank regulatory issues. His extensive experience with nonprofit organizations, including charities, foundations, and trade associations, benefits from his legal philosophy and his personal dedication. He has been active in the American Bar Association for many years and served as chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Committee of the Business Law Section from 2008 to 2011. A prolific writer and speaker in the nonprofit field, one of his most recent endeavors has been editing the fourth edition of the guidebook. Thanks for joining me today, Bill.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we have listeners all across the country, and I'm excited to give them an overview on this guidebook. But first of all, tell us a little bit about what inspired you to take on this project. It's a big one.
Well, it's a product of the Nonprofit Organizations Committee of the Business Law Section of the ABA. It's been a publication that the Nonprofit Organizations Committee has worked on since 1993. So this is the fourth edition, and committee members have, over the years, been working on updating the publication. I first got involved with the publication on the third edition. That was back in 2010 time period, in which I was very active in the nonprofit organization section.
I think that's when you and I first started working together on projects, yeah.
That's right. You were chair, and I followed you as the next chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Committee. And as you know, as chair, you seek out volunteers to work on different projects. And this was one of the projects. And I actually had been using the guidebook, the second edition primarily, found it very useful. So when the opportunity arose to be involved in working on the third edition, I was very eager to participate.
I still had the third edition on my bookshelf, and I just this morning compared the length of that one. It was, I think, 347 pages. This fourth edition is 370, so I guess every decade or so it's going to go up by 25 pages or so. Does that seem about right?
Yeah, that is right. It's interesting in terms of what the book is trying to cover. We're trying to provide information to directors of nonprofit organizations, and just the breadth of subject matter that directors will need to be thinking about has expanded. And so we're trying to address those different topics.
Yes. So talk a little bit about the intended audience. Is this a book just for lawyers who are directors, or is it for directors who aren't lawyers, or both?
It is a book. It's primarily written for directors of nonprofit organizations, specifically nonprofit corporations. We try not to write it in kind of legalese and try to write it in a way that will be understandable to non-lawyers, but it's also helpful for lawyers who are serving on boards or lawyers who are representing boards or nonprofit organizations. We are trying to address different topics that nonprofit directors might need to address. And because a lot of nonprofits have resource issues where they have small staffs and are not able to rely on others with regard to the activities of a nonprofit corporation, often the directors will have to get involved in working on different types of issues facing nonprofits. And so we've tried to identify those topics that would be most relevant to nonprofit directors as they're serving on the board. We hope, a helpful book for individuals who are thinking about serving on boards, because we have organized the publication so there's divided by chapters, and for each chapter, there are questions to be thinking about for the director or the prospective director on that particular chapter and topic that's covered in the chapter. And then also a checklist that we hope is helpful to nonprofits and to directors in thinking about, okay, what steps do we take to address particular issues with regard to the operation of the nonprofit?
Yeah, I really like the way the chapters are organized. And we'll go through some of the highlights in the substantive chapters, but they include both the citations for the lawyer or geeky researcher types and the suggested questions and the checklists. I think that's just such a fantastic way to organize the thinking. So you can, depending on the way the particular reader's mind works, you can dive right into the part that you really care about. So I love that about this book. So talk a little bit about the various chapters. There's probably too many for us to touch on all of them, but maybe starting with what's new in this edition. Any chapters here that are remarkable, either remarkable because they're new or remarkable because developments are new in those particular areas?
There are a couple new chapters, and basically we broke out existing chapters, some subject matter. So a new chapter that's by itself now is a chapter on officers of nonprofit corporations. We had that addressed in a chapter that covered committees of the nonprofit, but we thought that is such an important topic that it was important to have that be a separate chapter and to specifically expand on what the duties are, expectations would be for individuals serving as directors. We address, to a certain extent, the concept of staff serving as officers as well as board members serving as officers. I think sometimes there's a little confusion with regard to what are the fiduciary duties of an individual board member who's an officer versus a staff member who's an officer. And we try to address that in the chapter. Another chapter that's now a standalone chapter addresses business combinations. We did have that topic covered, but we expanded it in this edition. And we thought that was important just because we're seeing more activity with regard to mergers of nonprofits, sale or transfer of assets, and other affiliations that might occur. And we thought, because that's an issue that would be important to a director, that would make sense to further develop the discussion with regard to that topic. We added a discussion with regard to dissolution of a nonprofit corporation. We thought, given that from time to time a nonprofit board will need to be thinking about dissolving the nonprofit corporation, that it was important to discuss what steps need to be taken with regard to dissolution, as well as what considerations a board member might be thinking about with regard to taking this voting in favor of a dissolution of a nonprofit.
That reminds me of one thing I wanted to highlight here, and that is the laws, particularly on those areas, combinations and dissolutions, but also all the others as well. Much of it's state law driven. So we have readers all across the country in 50 different states, 52 legal jurisdictions, if not more. How does the guidebook deal with the fact the law could be different in your state? Are there common principles that go across the board? Talk a little bit about how a reader takes this and then applies their own state law or navigates their own state laws.
We try to address it in more general terms, in terms of what we think the general considerations need to be with regard to a transaction such as a merger of an entity. You're absolutely correct that the statutes are different between the states. So we identify, for instance, with regard to mergers, that there might be specific statutes that address certain issues, such as, for instance, the role of the Attorney General with regard to approving or at least being notified about a merger involving a nonprofit corporation. We do cite to some statutes in the book. It's not an exhaustive list of citations, but we do that primarily for purposes of just giving examples of what a state statute might provide with regard to a particular issue. In addition to that, we cite to the Model Nonprofit Corporation Act, which is another product of the Nonprofit Organizations Committee of the Business Law section. And this is a model act that the Nonprofit Organizations Committee is promoting around the states for states to consider for adoption. And that model act has been developed based on the developments in case law as well as statutory law around the country. So we think it's a good source to be looking to in terms of understanding different aspects of a nonprofit corporation, realizing, again, that states do differ. And so that when you are, for instance, facing a merger opportunity in a particular state, it will be important to be looking at your state statute.
Yeah, and I've noticed over the years, certainly you've been doing this as long as I have, so much more of the state-specific stuff is actually available on state websites, state corporations, Secretary of State or whoever the supervisor is. With the guidebook in one hand and your computer on the other, it should be pretty easy to at least find what the issues might be for your particular situation. Talk a little bit about legal requirements and good corporate practices. A lot of times clients come to me and say, I thought this was required. Somebody told me we have to do this. And it's not a have to, it's just a you should. How does the guidebook deal with the distinction between or advise readers on good corporate practice and what's actually legally required?
Yeah, we do try to distinguish between what is a legal requirement. And again, it's going to be state specific, so it's more in general terms, but we have a good sense of what the state statutes are requiring. And then as we get into the discussion of those state requirements, for instance, I'm thinking about the fiduciary duties imposed on directors of nonprofit corporations. We know that most nonprofit statutes do impose fiduciary duties, the duty of care and the duty of loyalty on directors. But we also know that the state statutes are fairly brief in terms of how they describe that those duties, what those duties are and how do you carry out those duties. And so we do in these chapters talk about what other considerations board members should be thinking about and what we think are best practices with regard to different types of activities. So, for instance, an example would be minute taking. We talk about what makes sense with regard to minutes of a board meeting. We talk about, for instance, executive session of a board meeting. Typically, a state statute doesn't get into imposing any type of the requirements with regard to those type of documents, but we do provide some guidance just based on experience around the states and with other organizations as to board members should be thinking about.
To pique the interest of listeners who might have particular issues in mind, can you talk a little bit about the organization of the guidebook? It looks like there's 15 chapters, kind of at a high level. What do the different chapters touch on?
Yeah, we start out talking about what is a board of directors, what's a nonprofit corporation, and then move from there to just the responsibilities of a board member, primarily looking at the fiduciary duties of a director. And that has been a chapter that's always been very close to the beginning of the book. It's a very important chapter, really sets out the responsibilities, the legal responsibilities of the director, as well as then we get into best practices with regard to what directors should be thinking about. From there, we move to other important parts of a nonprofit corporation, including the committees of the board, and discuss what the responsibilities are of committees, We talk, as I indicated, we have a new chapter on officers. So we talk about the relationship of the officers to the board, the relationship of the officers, for instance, the chair of the board to the executive director or CEO of the organization. But in any event, we're kind of talking about the operation from a governance standpoint, board, committees, and officers. From there, we move over to talking about topics that are going to be important for nonprofit corporations, such as tax issues. We have a chapter that summarizes different issues coming up with regard to nonprofit corporations and tax compliance. So it will be just talking about the different designations that a nonprofit could have in terms of being, for instance, a tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code or some other section of the code. And we'll talk about requirements imposed on organizations with the different tax exempt status.
So it's not a tax treatise, but it does explain how this guidebook is relevant to all form of nonprofit corporations, regardless of which of the, I think it's 501c1 through 27, 30. I don't know. There's a lot of C's. So it's useful to all of those. Okay, so after the tax exemption issues, then what other interesting chapters are in here?
We have a chapter on the nonprofit activities on the internet, which is an interesting topic. It's actually more than just talking about activities on the internet, because it gets into what are the types of activities and what are the requirements that are imposed on nonprofit corporations with regard to those activities. So for an example, we have in that chapter discussion with regard to charitable solicitations and fundraising. There are rules in each state with regard to what a nonprofit can do and what it cannot do, even when it's not doing it on the internet. But we also add to that discussion, okay, these are the rules with regard to that particular activity. But in addition, we lay out the rules as to when you start having those activities on the internet.
Well, that's going to be really useful.
Yeah, it's an interesting chapter because it covers a lot of activities. So we worked on the title of the chapter to try to make sure that people realize to me, it's more of like operations of the nonprofit. But for each of the activities, we do note how being involved on the internet for that particular activity, what rules might apply.
Makes it different. Yeah, there are some nonprofits that don't have much of an internet presence, but very few. It's almost mandatory now to have a website. So what are some other interesting chapters that you want to highlight?
Yeah, we have a chapter on employment issues, and then also a chapter on volunteer issues. Volunteers are a significant force in a nonprofit corporation, especially smaller ones. And without volunteers, a nonprofit may not be able to exist. And so volunteers are just so important to an organization, but they do create risk for the organization. So the purpose of the chapter is to discuss how a nonprofit might use volunteers and steps that a nonprofit should consider implementing in having a volunteer work group assisting it with the activities of the organization.
Segue to the other related topic, which is insurance and risk management. What does that chapter look like?
Yeah, we have a chapter that talks about what type of protections are available both to the organization as well as to the board of directors. We know that most board members are volunteers and that they are interested in knowing what risks are associated with being a director of a nonprofit corporation. So we think this is a good chapter, a helpful chapter to trying, if a nonprofit's trying to recruit or retain its directors, they can be looking to this particular chapter to provide information to the directors. We discuss the different types of protections that are available to the directors. We talk about the statutory protections, and again, unique to each state, but most states do have some type of protection that is in their nonprofit act that protects volunteer directors in their service as a member of the board. We also have a part of the chapter that focuses in on directors and officers liability coverage and discusses what that coverage does, what it may not do, and considerations that board members should be thinking about with regard to asking about D&O coverage. Those two topics. In addition, we talk about indemnification of directors and how nonprofit can ensure that it is set up or structured to indemnify its directors if it so wishes to do so. Because indemnification is only as good as the assets of the organization, it is noted in this particular chapter that the D&O coverage can be extremely important and something that a director should be expecting to have.
So any other chapters you want to highlight that we haven't already talked about? I know we've talked about dissolution a little bit and mergers.
We have a chapter on director orientation in terms of getting on the board and then also having served on the board. What are expectations for board members in terms of receiving materials, reviewing materials, being educated about the activities of the organization? The chapter addresses orientation type activities. Also have discussion about different ways to communicate with the board, such as through email, through in-person meetings, through virtual meetings, and talks about the benefits of each of those and also the risks associated with each of those.
Well, that's fantastic. So it clearly covers everything that I get asked about on a daily basis. That's going to be super useful to the field. Where can listeners buy the guidebook?
It is available through the American Bar Association, and there are a couple ways of getting to the Bar Association website. One is just doing a Google search. And I think if you do a Google search for the Guidebook for Directors of Nonprofit Corporations, 4th edition, that should get you to the publications website for the ABA. The other is just to go to the ABA website, and then I think there's a publications tab that you can hit and then do a search for the book once you get to the publications.
You don't have to be a member of the American Bar Association to buy the book, right?
That's correct.
It's available to anybody. I'll put a link in the show notes directly to the ABA page then to make it easy for listeners to find it if they want to track it down through the show notes.
That would be great.
Well, I can't thank you enough, Bill. This is going to be so useful to the field. I'm sure that the guidebook will be as well received as the previous editions. I think it's usually one of the top sellers for the ABA, isn't it? It's a very popular guidebook.
It is. It is a top seller. It's interesting. The Corporate Laws Committee also has its own publication called the Corporate Directors Guidebook, and that is a bestseller for the for-profit world. And then the Guidebook for Directors of Nonprofit Corporations is a bestseller for the nonprofits. So we've been very happy with the sales over the years with regard to these guidebooks.
Yeah, they're just so important because, so many people sit on boards and work for nonprofits, and it's just a terrific resource. So thank you for joining me today to talk about it, and thank you for all the hours that you've put into the guidebook. I know it's going to be a resource until the 5th edition comes out. Have you recruited your successor yet? Or are you and Lisa all in for the next edition?
I'm not certain about that. I think it's every 10 years, so I don't know
who knows?
The next edition. But it's a great education each time I read through it. And it's kind of funny because I keep a list of books I read during the year. And I think I've read this book 3 times this year because we were going through the review process.
Well, and the other thing is your chapter authors and contributors are like a who's who of the nonprofit organizations bar. It gives you that added networking opportunity, too. It's just a fantastic group of authors.
Well, that's right. And I particularly thank you because you reviewed the chapter on endowments and giving to organizations.
Yeah, that's a fun chapter to review every time also. So I'm happy to be involved, but it's like just a tiny bit of time compared to what you and Lisa have put into it. So again, thank you so much. And I'm hopeful we'll do the review of the 5th edition in a decade or so, but we'll see.
Well, thank you very much.
So that's all for this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to more resources and for organized playlists on this and other related charitable topics. You can check out the Farella YouTube channel for all of our charitable organization and philanthropy law resources. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.